Thanks for coming up. I'm just going to talk from down here. Uh, well, the first question is, what's your name?
My name is Frances Greenberg.
And where were you born?
I was born in Paris, France.
And when were you born?
I was born July 10th, 1937. My name then was Fanny Silverstein. That was my given name was Funny, which is, I guess, Fanny.
Oh, okay.
There are many times when I would call myself Françoise, because as a child, Funny was kind of a strange name when I came over, so I always told people my name was Françoise. But as a child, I was always called Funny. And I have a sister, Giselle, who was born February 1936. She's about a year and a half younger than I am.
And how old were you when you noticed things starting to get bad for the Jewish people where you were?
Well, my father and my mother, I know very little about my father's background, but I know originally he was from Poland, and his family were all born. After that, I think his brothers and sisters, which I never met, but he had a sister in France that we knew, and they all lived like French people. They did not seem like foreigner. My mother was from Poland. My mother went to Paris to go to school and study and become a dressmaker, and that met my father. My mother and my father were married, I believe, in their 30s, and they were like in the middle 30s, 33, 34, something like that. And all I can remember of my father, he was taken when I was 2 years old. So a lot of things happened before I actually can remember. When the war started, I can't remember what year it started in France, but I was too young to really notice. To me, when I think of France in my life, I feel like I was born into the war. And I know when I was born there was no war, but from my recollection, it seems like things were always bad and difficult, and we always were hungry, and we always were running. I don't remember the good times at all. So I think I was like a little over 2 when my father was taken.
What do you mean by taken?
Well, we lived in an apartment right in the middle of Paris, 154 Rue Bercanf, and it was right in the center of France. It was 11e arrondissement, which is 11th arrondissement. And from what I was told, my father was taken in the first raid, so that when he was taken, nobody was ready or prepared or really believed this would happen. I don't know if I remember my father being taken or I've been told what happened, but what my recollection is seeing my mother crying and my father being woken up middle of the night, and it was a knock on the door, and they told my mother they were taking my father, and he was in his pajamas. And she said, "No, you cannot do this," and she was crying and screaming, and I remember her being upset, and my sister, the two of us crying, and my father being dragged out of the house, and she was quickly making him a cup of tea, give him something, and she couldn't understand why they were taking him. But supposedly the people that came to the door were not actual Germans, I was told, were French working for the Germans at the time. They joined, either they had to for their own safety, I don't know, but they took my father right then and there with nothing, just whatever he had on. And after that, life became very difficult. Now, from what I was told, my father was not deported immediately to Germany. He was in a camp outside of Paris, because my mother and my sister went to visit him once. And then he was deported to Germany, and we never heard anything after that. Never heard about him or what happened to him or anything. So my mother started going back to work, and from what I don't understand is that when the Germans came, or the French, whoever took my father, they took the men first, the men and the boys, the older. They didn't take children or the women. Then they came after the women. Then they came after the children. They never took the whole family. So my mother was working and trying to make a living still and take care of us and take care of everything. And then we came home one day to find that the Germans had gone into our apartment and taken everything we owned. They've taken the furniture, the clothing, my mother's jewelry, whatever we owned. We were left with nothing. Everything was taken. Now, I don't remember exactly when, but my mother realized then that they were going to come after her. And we couldn't live there anymore. There was nothing to sleep on. And so she put us in our first home. I don't remember the year, but I was quite young. And this was my first home that was run by nuns. And it was not too far from Paris, because I don't recall traveling very far. But my mother and her friends, she had many women friends who lived in the neighborhood whose husbands also were gone. And they all placed their children in this one home, so the women could either work or hide. I'm not sure, but I think they were hiding, and it was a safe place to keep us so they could hide and run alone. It was much easier than having children. And the nuns, I remember, were wonderful. They took good care of us. And in that home, I don't remember going hungry. I remember that the care was good. Every Sunday, my mother would come and visit us. And there would be like a lunch in the cafeteria, and all the mothers would come, and the children would be with their mothers, and they would leave. One Sunday, I think the Germans got wind that the mothers were there. And one Sunday, the Germans broke into the cafeteria. And the nuns couldn't do anything. And they start running in the cafeteria, grabbing all the women. And my mother was sitting right next to me. And my mother was a very thin little person. And she disappeared. I don't know what happened to her. And I was watching women being dragged out. And one woman was a very heavy-set woman. And my sister once told me that she was going to have a baby. And they dragged her by the feet. And she was dragging, and she kept saying, please. And it was dragging her. She was wetting her pants. And it was just so unbelievable. And we were so frightened. And after everything calmed down, the nuns held us and hugged us. I asked, where's my mother? And nobody could find my mother. And one little boy told me that he had found a little hole next to the fireplace where either you say put wood or something. He had hidden her in there because she was little enough. So at least my mother was not taken in that raid at all. She was safe. And we hadn't seen her we didn't see her after that for quite a while. But we knew that she was safe. And then shortly later, I was taken out of that home. And we went into foster home, my sister and I. Different foster homes out in the country. And I don't know who planned these places or who found them, but it could have been the highest, because later on, the highest, the organization did kind of watch over us in places and homes. But we were in two homes. I remember the last name, one was Renault, and the other one was Lance. And I was little, but I remember their names. And they were non-Jews. I can't say they were good people. They did it for the money. They got paid for my mother. Where she got the money, I don't know. Her sister-in-law, my father's sister was living, and she had children who were older, who were very well-to-do. My father's side of the family was very well-to-do during the war. They were in leather imports, and my father also had a store. He had like a hardware store, which Germans, I guess, took everything. I don't know, but we ended up with nothing. But Jacques Plot, P-L-O-T, did have a business and had money, and I think he probably helped my mother. He probably helped her pay whoever was taking care of us. But in living in this country, I remember being out. There was a little lake. We'd be out on the lake in the middle of the day, and this was typical of France. The bombs would be coming. You could see the sky lit up with bombs. And then the sirens would. The sirens never rang before the bombs. You first saw the bombs, and then the sirens would ring. So you'd run for cover, and we'd run to their homes. And there would be every block a shelter, an air raid shelter underground. But we'd have to go to the home where the shelter would be. and we'd have to climb over the fence or wherever to get into the shelter. And we would live there maybe a day or two, one time weeks at a time, till it was safe to come out. And that's where we really went hungry, where we had maybe 1 or 2 pieces of bread all day, and just very little food, very little water. It was very, very hard there, because that was when the war in the country was worse than in Paris. I mean, we were really bombed. We would come up a few days later and we would see that every other home had been demolished. But thank God we never were physically hurt. But I remember when my mother came the next week to check on us, she was so frightened because she had heard the slow town had been hit. And she came at night. She snuck in at night and didn't even see us, because she knew if she saw us. But I could hear her. I could hear her crying, begging these people to feed us more, and she would give them more money if she just gave us more food. So this was my recollection of being out in the country with these people. And after that, I became sick from, I guess, malnutrition, and I developed what they call childhood tuberculosis. My sister did not get it, I did. And so I was separated from my sister and spent time in a sanitarium. And I can't tell you how long I was in each place, because all of it was, I lived in Paris till I was 10 and a half years old. I mean, in France. So how long I was in each place, I don't know. But it seemed like a long time. But the sanitarium, I got fed well, and I rested well. It was just a very lonely, lonely place. And it was also run by nuns. And I didn't tell anybody I was Jewish, because the war was still on. And the only ones who knew I was Jewish were the nuns. And one or two times, the Germans came in to the sanitarium, and we had to be all lined up. And they went from child to child, looking at them to see if they could find a Jew by looking at them. And I would stand so still, and they passed right by me. And the nuns told me never to tell any of the children I was Jewish, because accidentally they might say something. I went to confession. I talked to the priest. I still know all my French prayers by heart. The acte de contrition for, all my sins. And I would go and watch the movies about Christ. And it was really, it was something I needed. It was good for me. And every night I would pray. My mother would get well. My father would come back. It was a crutch maybe, but it was something I really needed. So when the nuns asked if I would like to convert to Catholicism, I jumped for it. I thought it was great. But when she called or wrote to my aunt in France, my aunt says no. She says that they could not give permission for that. So I stayed there, and then I did get better and went back home to my mother. And this was, in between that, I think after that home, we went to a Jewish home. I was in very few Jewish orphanages. But after that, I believe we lived with my sister and I, the two of us, in a Jewish orphanage that was a chateau. It's a chateau that I think today people go in there and visit and pay to see the chateau. And during the war, they turned these chateaus into orphanages, Jewish orphanages. And from what I read today, a lot of Germans knew where they were, but we always felt safe in them. And they would transport us from the chateau in army trucks with a big tarp over it. That's how we were always transferred. And I was still not well, but I remember I could only go to school like half a day or once a week. I couldn't go to school full time. I was still didn't have my strength. But we lived there, and it was a frightening place, because every time there was air raid siren, we'd have to run in the basement and hide and lay. And any day we thought the Germans would walk in and take us all. And from there, I can't remember when I was separated from my sister, but we were in other orphanages also. And after that, I think the other stories that I recall is going back to Paris during the war and spending time with my mother. And she took us back home with her, but she had no place to live. So we went to live at her friend Berthe. And I can't remember if it was before that orphanage or after, but we went to stay at Berthe's because she just was tired of running and hiding. Berthe lived about a mile from where my mother was living. And there was a long hallway and a concierge. Then there were steps going to the right, like five flights. And Bert lived in a little, you'd go straight and there was like a little courtyard, and she'd be on the second apartment. So we went to her apartment, and the concierge said that all the Jews had left, that we could not stay there because the Germans were coming and we had to leave. Everybody had to leave. And my mother and her friend Bert, who had a little boy called Armand, said, we have no place to go. We have no place to go. We have to take our chances. And the concierge says, but if they find you here, they will take me also. And she said to my mother and Bert, she says, I'll tell you what you do. You leave all your furniture in your apartment, and you live on the 5th floor in the last apartment, on the top. You just stay there during the day, and at night, just go to your apartment for things you need and go back to the last apartment. Everything was empty. There was not a person living in the whole building, because I guess they'd been all Jews in that building. And there was a barber shop underneath this one building, and because when we were kids, we used to play outside, and the barber was a nice man. So that's what we did. And I remember living in that empty apartment, and my mother would put us in the closet at night, and we would sit in the closet. Then we heard anybody coming out, we'd close the door, and she would put me in the pillowcase, hide me in the pillowcase. But we lived there day after day, and it worked. You know, it was fine, it worked, and little by little, we started coming out and going shopping because the Germans weren't coming. Things were calming down. And we were there probably a few weeks, and I was upstairs with Bert and Armand. Now with Bert and my mother. And Armand, who was younger than us, was playing outside with my sister, Giselle. And all of a sudden we could hear the Germans marching, and they were coming down the street. And then we were trapped on the top floor with the children downstairs. And my mother and Bert didn't know what to do. What do they do now? So they looked outside, and they see the barber, who was a non-Jew, said to the children, come to Papa. He pretended to be their father. So he took them in, and we were upstairs, and we looked at each other, and we went into the closet, and we just sat there. Now, we didn't know what was going on till later on, till my mother spoke to the concierge, and they were hugging and kissing. Well, what had happened is that the Germans went from apartment to apartment, and she says, no, the Jews, I got rid of them. And they started looking in all the apartments. They started looking in all the apartments, and they went in the courtyard, and they went to the first floor, and they went from room to room. When they got to the top floor, she yells to them, you're hungry, you're thirsty, I made you some good food. So the concierge goes all the way up to the top floor with a tray of food and wine, whatever she had, cheese. And they sat down at top floor, and they ate, and they drank, and it was her life too in jeopardy if they found us. And after talking to them, she starts coming down, says, come back to my house, I have more. And they left and went down and never checked the last apartment. And that would have been the end of us if they would have found us. That was probably the closest we came to all being taken. But it's something that, I don't know what part of the war that was, but it's something that really stayed in my mind. And the other time, as far as the wartime, I remember when they announced that the war was over. And I didn't understand, but I remember I was in a home, and the children were jumping and happy and wonderful. But I guess by then, my mother either had died or was dying. I don't recall. No, my mother died after the war, because I remember being taken to Paris with my sister to the hospital. And she was laying in the bed in the hospital room. And I knew she was sick, but I didn't know she was going to die. And I guess she must have been dying. That's why they called us into Paris. And she laid in bed and gave us candy and hugs and kisses. And I told her, I said, I go to church. And she says to me, you go to church and you pray. God will hear you wherever you go. And maybe your father will come back to you. But she said to me, but someday you're going to know you're a Jew. Someday it will come back to you that you are a Jew. And I never forgot that, even though Catholicism stayed with me for so many years. It was part of me. It was really something I needed. But I remember hearing my mother's voice about Judaism. But my mother died, and we never were taken to a cemetery or nothing. They let us see my mother, and I don't know if it was good or bad, but for years I kept thinking my mother was still going to come. And every time I would ask about my mother, they would tell me she's in the hospital, she's getting better, And I didn't think much of it because I've been in a sanitarium and I was, getting better and I was better. And I was in actually two different sanitariums because after my mother died, I got sick again and went to another sanitarium that's also run by nuns. But my mother was dead by then, and I didn't. My sister knew because I think my sister would cry and she'd say to me, if you knew what I knew, you would cry too. And I never wanted to know what she knew. I never asked her. I didn't want to know. During the war, after the war, my sister was a strong one. I was the one that would cry and scream when the bombs, and my sister would hold on to me. My sister never cried. My sister was the tough one. She was not that much older than I was, but she was the protector. She always, took care of me when we were together. But the second sanitarium I was in, I was like, if the war was over, my sister was living with we called him Uncle Jacques, but he was really a cousin, the one that was so well-to-do. And I think at the time he had 5 children. And he had an apartment in Paris, he had a home in Neuilly-Plaisance, he had a home on the seashore, and cars. He was very well-to-do. So my sister was living with them at the time. And I was coming home from the sanitarium, and he was to come pick me up and bring me to my sister and to the whole family. And what I remember about that is that I was in a sanitarium, and they drove me to a place where Uncle Jacques was supposed to come and pick me up. And there were children, sitting around the table, and parents would come pick them up. And it was a home either for babies, orphanage, or orphans, or women who had children. I don't know, but it was a home with a lot of babies, only babies, and nurses and doctors, and nobody came for me. And I waited all night long, and nobody came for me. So I didn't know what to do with me, so they kind of made shift a bed so I could sleep overnight. And a few days came by, a few weeks came by, and nobody came for me. And they didn't know how to reach Jacques, I guess. Nobody knew how to reach him. He knew where I was, but we didn't know how to reach him. Nobody seemed to know. So it was a very lonely place. I mean, the women were very nice, and I helped take care of the babies. I was probably 8 or 9 years old by then. And I wanted to go home. I wanted to see my sister. And I don't know if I was there months or weeks. It was just a long time. And being so religious, I remember to this day going to bed and praying. And I prayed to God that tonight, God, I'm going to pray that tomorrow is going to be a good day. No one's going to sin, and it's going to be a good day for you. There was a nurse, her name was Nicole, and she was a young girl who volunteered, and she was wonderful. She was the only young person there. And she would come from school and volunteer, and I hadn't seen her a long time. And I said, God, the second day, I want Nicole to come and help me take care of the babies, because I miss her. And the third day, God, I want Uncle Jacques to come and take me home. So the first day, nothing happened. The second day, Nicole walks in, and she hadn't been there a long time. The third day, I packed my bags, and all the nurses were going, poor child. She thinks she's going home because she prayed. I said, I'm going home. I know I'm going home. I know Jacques' going to come. I've been here too long, and I used to make toys. I used to make stuffed animals and dolls, and I gave them all away to everybody. And I sat in the long hallway with my little suitcase, and everybody went to bed, and they left me sit there. And 11:30, that door flew open, and Uncle Jacques walked in the door. And they all stood, and they all ran out. They couldn't believe it. I said, I knew. Well, after that, nobody could tell me there was no God. Whatever I prayed, it worked. I remember getting in a car with him, and I don't think he understood how happy I was, because he didn't understand what I went through waiting for him. And we drove all night long. All night long we drove to Paris. And when I got they were living at the time in Neuilly-Plaisance, which is like a suburb of Paris. And when I saw my sister and the family and my cousins, it was so wonderful. We spent, this is after the war, we spent that whole summer with them. But when winter came, he went back to Paris, and he had us live with his maiden butler, who lived because he didn't have room for us. So it was kind of hard, but I didn't realize at that time things were still in the works for us to come to America. My mother's death wish was that we go to Brazil, to her sister who lived in Brazil, after, when she died, if we could, or to America. Her first choice was Brazil because it was her sister. And in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, which is right near Pittsburgh, is her brother. And I think my mother knew that her sister would be more willing to help us than her brother's wife, who had raised a family, but we could not get to Brazil. And I think what held us back from coming earlier was my health. I was better, but they had to prove to them. And once you have any kind of tuberculosis, there's always a scar. And every time I take a TB test, it was always positive. So that's what I think took so long getting us over to America. But we finally came in, I'm trying to think, I think it was the fall of 1948 or 49. I don't recall, 48. But, and who put us actually on my family paid for the trip. But Jacques, when we finally were able to come, drove us to Cannes. We went to Cannes, and we took the boat off at Cannes. And the Hayes took pictures of us, and I don't know how much the Hayes had to do with us coming, but we took the boat. It was called the Sobieski. It took us over 10 days to get here. And it was just the two of us, just two young girls on the ship with nobody watching over us. And we came to this country, to New York, and that's when, from New York, we have cousins, and then we went to Canonsburg and lived with I don't know how much more you want to know of the rest of I mean, after I came here, it was a struggle because we were not wanted by the aunt. So, but...
No, those sound fascinating. I'd love to hear about it, but I think for this tape, at
right,
least, we
okay.
gotta stick to the Holocaust. And I guess, are these experiences during the war the worst thing you can remember in your life?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think the different times Ron was taken, and, there was one incident where it was, when the war was over, what was hard for people to understand is that our lives didn't change. We didn't go hungry. I remember really being hungry as a child. Really, we would eat anything. I mean, we lived in one home where we would save snails. And today you couldn't even look at a snail. But we would save snails because when it rains in France, the snails come out. And it was a yellow snail. It was like a brownish. There's only certain snails that are not poisonous. And we would save enough snails to make a bucket of it so we could cook snails to eat. And we ate whatever we could. Today, I keep kosher because I have a religious family, but we ate whatever we could get a hold of. And I was never a real skinny kid, but unfortunately, my sister was the thin one and the healthy one. I was not skinny, but the sick one. And after school, they would have, in France, where they would help you and give you cereal, after school, like food for the children that were so thin. They would send me home, and I was a sick one, and feed my sister. And my mother, this is when I was with my mother off and on, she'd say to my sister, "Can't you bring your sister something to eat? Are you eating it all by yourself?" Well, they were giving her mother's oats. She told my mother, "How can I bring you her mother's oats?" But the worst times were not only the war, but feeling like nobody really wanted you. Nobody really wanted you. We were always pushed from place to place. From place to place. There was one foster home we lived in the country. It was the most wonderful place, the most wonderful people. And we were taken away from them, and I don't know why we were taken away. Maybe I was sick in it, I don't know, but I could have lived with those people in the country and never missed anybody in my family. They were that good to us. And I don't know how long, it seemed like we lived with them a long time, but they treated us like we were really their children. And that was unusual, because we lived with foster home where we were abused, where we had to do all the work. They wouldn't send us to school. When we were sick, they wouldn't send us to a doctor. And that we survived it as well as we did is amazing.
You're a witness to history. If in 100 years someone watches this videotape, what's the most important thought you'd like to leave that person with?
Well, what's the most important thought? It's the whole thing is a frightening thing, and yet we went back to Paris 10 years ago to see my family, and I really went back to see my mother's friends, the people who really cared, who really gave us love and affection, and they could not believe that not only are we Jewish and we're religious, that I have a son today that's a rabbi. And I think that when he was a little boy, I used to talk to him about my mom and my dad, and he really wanted to do something for losing his grandparents. And he is a rabbi today, and when he went to Paris, when he went to France, he's the first one to go to Paris before we ever went. He went to the cemetery, and Bert was able to take him to where my mother was buried. And there's a man who runs a cemetery who took my son to the gravesite. And I think the saddest thing was that my mother was buried in a grave. It's unfortunately a multiple grave. I think there's 4 people in that grave. And it was hard for my sister to understand that, but that's the way it was then. People were dying, so many at one time, and I guess there was no money. But my son, Stephen, went to the grave, and he wanted to say the prayer. And the man who took him there said, "I will say the prayer for you, and you'll pay me." And he said, "This is my grandmother. If you don't mind, I'll say the prayer. I know it." He says, "I'm fluent in Hebrew, but I will still pay you." And what my mother went through, as hard as it was for my sister and I, we were children. And a lot of it, I don't think, even though I was a very frightened child, a lot of it I could forget and play. But what my mother went through as a mother, now that I'm a parent, that would be horrible, just horrible. But it scares me when I hear today what's going on and that it could happen again. And that's frightening. Because I just can't, to me, I came to this country to be safe and to raise a family. And when I hear that what's going on in Germany, what's going on in the South, it's very frightening to me that my children, my grandchildren might have to go through this again.